Right, so we're going to be doing the human trafficking awareness and prevention training. My name is Sarah Chow. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator. I work with the Human Trafficking Support Team here at the Asian Association of Utah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Ceballos, and I'm the Director of Prevention and Education at Peace House.
Perfect. So, kind of going over, I think, Emma, you're going over objectives.
Yes, I am going over objectives. So, what are the objectives for today? We want to define human trafficking and recognize the potential indicators of trafficking. We want to summarize the risk factors for victimization and describe the dynamics of control and implement strategies and tools to prevent abuse between caregivers and youth. So, these are our objectives.
Awesome. So, why are we learning about human trafficking? So, human trafficking is considered one of the fastest growing illicit industries here in the US. It is happening here in Utah and it's very prevalent. Oftentimes, victims are not seeking help. So, only about 1% of trafficking victims are actually identified, and only about 5% of victims will receive treatment. And without receiving treatment, 80% of them are at risk of being re-victimized. And so, when I talk about treatment, what that typically looks like is getting access to social support services such as AAU or Peace House. And then another thing is the average age of entry into the commercial sex trade is 12 years old. And so just giving a quick disclaimer that some of these topics that we're going to cover may include sensitive content, and it may be difficult to present and may possibly be triggering to some participants. So just keeping that in mind as we go through the presentation, that if you do need to take a moment to step away, please do so.
We also wanted to cover some norms. We want to make sure that, because this can be triggering, right? We just want to make sure that you take care of yourselves. So safety, also mandatory reporting is very important. If anyone, we are all mandatory reporters in the state of Utah, even if it's only the suspicion of abuse or neglect. So we want to make sure that everyone is aware that if you reach out to either of us, and you give us information, we will have to make a report if it comes to a child or a vulnerable adult, anyone 65 and older. Confidentiality, everything that we share in this presentation, feel free to share with your communities and circles, but anything that is shared, in other spaces, like say if this was a presentation and there were live, it was live and there were people and they were sharing their personal stories, we want to make sure that it stays here in this space. And then self-care, take care of yourselves, as Sarah mentioned. If you need to step away to drink some water or nibble with a pen, free feel to do so. We just want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself while receiving this information.
Perfect. So the question, has anybody heard of human trafficking? And taking this into consideration, what have you been exposed to human trafficking? Have you seen any movies? Have you heard any stories about local news of cases of human trafficking? So kind of taking that into consideration and kind of how you would define human trafficking. So what does human trafficking look like for you? How would you define it? So kind of with all that information, giving a formal definition of what human trafficking looks like. So Webster Dictionary defines human trafficking as an organized criminal activity in which human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited, as by being forced into engaging in commercial sex or involuntary labor. So again, that emphasis is really on that commercial element piece. So is there an exchange of some sort of sex or involuntary labor in exchange for some sort of good or service? So what I like to do when I'm talking about this definition and giving this definition of human trafficking is I like to pair it with this AMP model. So this model is really helpful if we're talking about prosecuting cases of human trafficking. However, I think it can be very easily translated into building and incorporating into conversations that we may be having with people that we work with our loved ones, things of that nature. And so this AMP model really aims to look at what actions were taken by the trafficker, by what means, and for what purpose. And so when we talk about actions, this can look like recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining. And one more thing that I do want to mention. So when we're talking about what actions are taken by the trafficker, taking into consideration our previous exposure to human trafficking or maybe our lack of exposure to human trafficking, there might be this misconception of transporting, and that if we're watching certain movies, such as the movie Taken, we may be seeing this idea that a trafficking victim is oftentimes being transported to different countries, maybe to different states. But this is actually not truly the case. Transportation is not needed in order for human trafficking to be present. Sometimes it is an element that is involved in human trafficking, but it's oftentimes not necessary in order for it to occur. So just giving that little disclaimer, talking about recruitment, we will get into a little bit more of this later on in the presentation, so I would hold off on that. Talking about by what means. So what means did the trafficker use to induce this person into engaging in some sort of service? This could use be the use of fraud. So it can oftentimes be sexual assault, isolation. Force can often be used with certain weapons. When we're talking about fraud, this looks like false promises. So maybe, offering a certain job and it actually isn't the job that they thought it was going to be, things of that nature. And then coercion is threats of serious harm to either that individual or others around them. This also looks like controlling an individual's daily life and oftentimes involves sextortion or blackmail. And then again, for the purpose, it's always for some sort of commercial sex act or some sort of forced labor or debt bondage. Again, that emphasis on that commercial element of human trafficking is absolutely needed. One more thing that I did want to talk about as it relates to human trafficking and how we're defining this and talking about this A&P model is that when we're talking about working with youth, so any youth that are under the age of 18 that are induced into commercial sex acts cannot legally consent to sex. And so therefore, if they are induced into commercial sex acts, they are automatically considered a victim and treated as such. So there is no need for us to show that there's force, fraud, or coercion.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to go over youth and safe harbor law. Youth engaged in commercial sex or forced labor should always be considered a victim and treated as such. This is very important to be reminded. There is not such a thing as child prostitute. Youth engaged in commercial sex cannot be subjected to juvenile delinquency proceedings, but must be directed to DCFS, the Children Protective Services. We just want to make sure that people know that, right? That they cannot be, they cannot be charged because they are the victims of the crime. Youth wrongfully adjudicated as delinquent for conduct they engage in only as a result of trafficking can petition courts to have such convictions vacated. There is not such a thing as child prostitute, as I mentioned. So basically, safer harbor laws were created as a safety net for youth that committed crimes as a result of their trafficking. So we just want to emphasize that because this is kind of falling into like that whole like victim blaming, right, culture. And as we're saying, there's not such a thing as a child prostitutes because they're not able to consent. So they are the victims. Mm-hmm.
So a few true or false questions. So first one, children and teens can consent to participate in commercial sex activities. Is this true or false? It's actually false. So the next one, the average age of entry into the commercial sex trade is 12 years old. This is true. Is this my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So talking about human trafficking here in Utah. Yes. So looking at our agency, taking a step away about Utah specific data, and as Utah specific data, looking at data specifically related to youth. So this is from our trafficking in persons, so our human trafficking support program here in 2022. This was a breakdown of the youth that we had served in that year. So program wide, we served a total number of 255 survivors of human trafficking. 154 were primary survivors, with 16% of our youth survivors making up that majority of that primary survivor, with 7% of them under the age of 18. Of our secondary survivors, we served 101 secondary survivors. So when I talk about secondary survivors, this oftentimes looks like spouses of the primary survivor or children, and about 65% of our secondary survivors identified as youth. Taking a little bit more of a closer look at how their trafficking type was broken down. So we work with both sex and labor trafficking survivors. I will talk a little bit more about what our program does specifically later in the presentation. But of the youth survivors that we served, 21% of our youth survivors in 2022 identified as sex trafficking survivors, and then 17.1% of our youth identified as labor trafficking survivors. There is oftentimes that intersection of sex and labor trafficking, so where there are aspects of both. About 0% of our youth survivors met that criteria, but talking about our primary survivors as a whole, 10% of our survivors met that criteria. Taking a little bit further look at the youth breakdown as it relates to our program specifically, that 52% of them identified as labor trafficking survivors and 48% of them identified as sex trafficking survivors. Taking a little bit closer of a look at the gender breakdown, 68% of our youth that we worked with identified as female and 32% of our youth identified as male. Our biggest race demographic that we had served in 2022 is 68% of them identifying as Hispanic and then 20% of them identifying as white. For nationality and status, 36% of our youth identified as U.S. citizens and 64% of them were foreign nationals. Country of origin, I won't list through all of those, but one of the biggest countries of origin that we tend to see was the U.S., Guatemala, and then Mexico. All right, I think this one is mine as well.
Yes.
Yes? Cool. So human trafficking cases here in Utah. So kind of taking a step away, we just looked at a whole bunch of numbers, but what does this look like here in the state of Utah geographically? So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about what this map looks like, but on here you will see some hotspots, and those hotspots tend to indicate where cases of human trafficking occur. This is from 2017, and these are of reported cases of human trafficking. So taking into consideration, when it comes to talking about data and where we're seeing trends of human trafficking occur, we're never really going to get that true prevalence of what human trafficking looks like for a multitude of reasons. We're getting data from different sources. Maybe there's a lack of knowledge about human trafficking, where victims may oftentimes not even identify as a survivor. So there can definitely be a lot of contributing factors as to why we're never going to get a true scope of data as it relates to human trafficking. But with this, kind of some trends that we're seeing here on this map of Utah is that we're seeing it occur in a lot of populous areas. So if you look at the picture on here, we see that there's a really, really high hot red spot in Salt Lake City. And so oftentimes when we're talking about the more populated as an area is, the higher increase of criminal activity, and oftentimes human trafficking will follow suit. We see this occur along I-15 as well. So Utah is considered the crossway of the West. And so oftentimes if there is transportation involved, again, not always necessary or not always needed for human trafficking to occur, that Utah is a great way for individuals to utilize that easy trade route to be able to transport individuals. Utah is also considered a very rural state, and so we do have a lot of cases where there's a lot of agricultural trafficking, labor trafficking that is occurring in the state of Utah, and so that's kind of why we're seeing this in Price area, Cedar City, St. George. So just kind of looking at this in a more geographical sense of where actually is human trafficking occurring here in the state of Utah. I think this one is mine as well. So talking about where human trafficking occurs, again, we just looked at that geographic map of the state of Utah, but what are the industries what are the industries that are impacted by human trafficking? So on this slide, you can see a few industries that have a little star on them, and these ones are the ones that are most common here in the state of Utah. If anybody has interest in looking at the industries that are impacted in more detail, Polaris actually released a typology report in 2017 that talks about the 25 different types of modern slavery. This goes into a little bit more of a breakdown about the victim demographics, the trafficker profiles, the methods of control that were typically used, things like that. It's a really, really interesting and robust report. So if anybody does have interest in looking at that, we will make sure to send that information. But looking at Utah specifically, so where we're seeing industries that are impacted by sex trafficking, this occurs oftentimes in pornography scenes, massage parlors, streets, and residence-based commercial sex. So when I say residence-based commercial sex, this often times looks like where their trafficker is forcing them to engage in commercial sex in the home. So whether their trafficker is providing them that housing or they're forced to go and engage in sex work in other residence-based locations, that's what we talk about. We will get into risk factors and vulnerabilities. So we will revisit some of these locations and industries that are impacted as it relates to risk factors and vulnerabilities. Taking a step looking at labor trafficking. So looking at industries that are impacted by labor trafficking, we see this a lot in agricultural industries. Had I mentioned before that Utah is a very rural state, and so we are seeing that being affected. Restaurants, and then also hotels and motels. So when we're talking about hotels and motels, we typically see this in Park City. There's a lot of opportunity for seasonal work and for individuals to come over on what we call a J1 visa, which is technically like an internship visa. And that's oftentimes where we're seeing that exploitative situation happen, is in those hotel motel scenes.
Thank you for bringing that up, Sarah.
Yeah.
Very important. We do see a lot of J1 seasonal workers in
Mhm.
Park City. So yes, I just want to invite everyone to, what do you visualize when you see the word victims of human trafficking? Just kind of like sit on like what do you think, what pops up for you? Because in reality, it can happen to anyone, no matter what your race is, your age or gender. Is an issue that affects everyone. We just want to reiterate that, such as domestic violence and sexual assault, it affects everyone, right? And it ends when no one is getting hurt, right? So that's the goal,
Mhm.
that we're able to eradicate violence. This is why we have these conversations that are hard to have, but this is where the prevention happens. So it's very good to be here. And now we're gonna go over risk factors and trafficking vulnerabilities. So this is a list. I'm just kind of I want to invite everyone to look over it. But basically, the one most common vulnerability is poverty. And we have poverty, we have homelessness, substance abuse, history of sexual abuse and assault, child abuse and neglect, runaway. There's also age, juvenile justice or foster care, mental health problems, LGBTQI plus, domestic violence, displaced persons such as refugees or immigrants. So this is important to know, right? Because many human trafficking victims experience multiple forms of abuse, such as domestic violence or sexual assaults, and there's overlaps. There's methods of abuse, the power and control that exists in trafficking, as well as domestic violence and sexual violence. Similarly, victims are subject to physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and economic abuse, as well as isolation. There's a cycle of violence. Traffickers, like abusers, use cyclical violence to control victims by making promises of love or a better life, and by using shame and manipulation. And that increased vulnerability, those who have experienced and been exposed to domestic violence are at a higher risk of experiencing trafficking exploitation. Trafficking by intimate partners and family. So this happens quite a bit, and is a very scary situation, but it does. And the top recruitment strategy for victims of sex trafficking involves the trafficker presenting themselves as an intimate partner and familiar trafficking. So this is something that happens. And there's grooming tactics, as we're seeing here in the screen. They will use phrases like, if they want love, they give them love and become their significant other. If they need a place to live, they offer them shelter. If they're lonely, they become their friend. If they don't have a loving father or mother, they become their protector. And if they have a poor or low self-esteem, they sell them a dream of a better life or status. So this is how people groom other people, and make put them in this, and make they become victims of human trafficking because of this, which is
Yeah.
yeah.
Kind of just want to jump back. So to
Yes.
talk a little bit more about risk factors and trafficking vulnerabilities, Emma did a really good job of explaining, all the different considerations to take into of like what has a person experienced in their past and how is this affecting them and putting them at risk of maybe being exposed to a future exploitative situation. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences. So having those prior experiences of trauma in some sort of form or another can make it really difficult and can really increase a person's vulnerability to being exposed to a future trauma. But again, we do not want to create this as a checklist. We really want you to take into consideration the context of the whole entire person and really what they've experienced in their past and who they are as a person, and how this is taking into consideration their increased exposure to a potentially exploitive situation. So yeah, as Emma already talked about, going into some grooming tactics, and what I like to say when we're talking about grooming tactics as it relates to traffickers is that they will present and adopt a grooming or recruitment tactic based on the vulnerability that the person is presenting. So if we're talking about a person that maybe is experiencing homelessness and doesn't have a place to stay, how is that trafficker going to recruit them? Offering them a place to stay. If a person maybe didn't have a supportive home growing up and is really just looking for that loving mother or father figure, that trafficker can present themselves as such. If we're talking about maybe for a young person wanting to experience love or have a significant other, that trafficker could present themselves and present themselves as a significant other, give them that love and attention that they're searching for. So again, an easy way to remember this is that recruitment tactic and the grooming tactic is going to be dependent on the vulnerability that the person is presenting, and the trafficker will change their recruitment tactic to meet that need of that person. So, is this one mine going into recruitment tactics?
Yes.
Okay, so some top recruitment tactics, which Emma kind of already touched on a little bit, is that one of the biggest recruitment tactics that we are tending to see that is an ever-growing issue is familial trafficking. So we actually have a slide following this one that will go into a little bit more detail. But looking specifically at sex trafficking, one of the biggest recruitment tactics that we are seeing with sex trafficking clients here in Utah is their trafficker presenting themselves as an intimate partner. So really offering them that love, showing up as a boyfriend or girlfriend is really kind of that initial way that they're recruiting the individuals that they're exploiting. Talking about labor trafficking specifically, what we tend to see is kind of an intersection of all of these different types of recruitment tactics. So they could be offering this person some sort of job, and maybe that job isn't actually what they thought there was. So there's some sort of false promises or fraud. Maybe they're offering to pay for their housing and they're going to be living in this great place. Maybe their trafficker is even helping them get to the US and is helping transport them and their family and saying, okay, well, you'll be able to like pay off this debt once you get here to the US and start making money because you're going to be making this much money. And so we oftentimes see those recruitment tactics for labor trafficking intersecting one another. And so there's kind of aspects of all of it.
Yeah, so now we're going to touch on familial sex trafficking. So, what is the definition when a family member or guardian is the victim's trafficker or the one who sells the child to a third party trafficker? It involves traffickers who sell victims for profit, giving offenders sexual access to the victims in exchange for drugs, money, or something else of value. So basically, minors are the prime targets. Global Slavery Index report that 1,744 cases of child trafficking were reported between 2019 and 2020. Average age of a victim of familial trafficking is between 11 to 14 years old, and some children are victimized as early as infancy. So this is important to know because sometimes we have this misconception that trafficking looks a certain way when in reality it can be, familial sex trafficking, and it can be happening in our neighborhoods. We just are not aware of it.
Yeah, for
Mhm.
sure. And one more thing that I do want to add about this when we're talking about familial sex trafficking and we're talking about numbers, had I mentioned earlier that like the noted thing that Global Slavery Index reports that there was 1,700 cases, those were reported cases, but what's
Mhm.
the real reality of how many things are going unreported? When we're talking about familial trafficking in general, it is often a very scary place to be in because there can when we're talking about the trafficking happening in such a private location, if it's occurring in the home with trusted adults that you would hopefully assume that they have the best intentions for their child, it can oftentimes lead to a place where there is that underreported nature and we really don't know what's going on.
Yes, so we also wanted to touch base about familial trafficking versus child abuse because this is very important to know. There is an overlap between child trafficking is always child abuse, but not all child sexual abuse is trafficking. The commercial element is the key difference. Child trafficking charges carry a more severe sentence for perpetrator when it's only, that's the difference, but it does have that commercial element where people are receiving money or something of value in exchange for the sex with a minor.
Yeah, that really is the biggest distinction oftentimes when we are talking about human trafficking, specifically for familial trafficking. If there is some sort of abuse that is going on in the home, oftentimes people will ask, well, does that mean that it's trafficking because it's happening in the home and it's the family member that's doing it? Not necessarily. We really need to ask those questions of, is there that commercial element? Is this child being forced to engage in some sort of sexual activity in exchange for some other good? So maybe is this
Mhm.
child engaging in sex so that the mom or the parent can have that money to be able to pay for the rent or has access to drugs because they're exploiting their child. That's kind of the key difference.
Mhm.
So where's recruitment tactics or where's recruitment happening? So recruitment can happen in a lot of different places. Again, I like to say that recruitment happens in places where we're going to find groups of vulnerable people. So if we're talking about a trafficker that wants to recruit somebody that's experiencing homelessness and offer them a place to stay, they can recruit them at homeless shelters or they can go to libraries or parks or streets. If we're talking about recruiting an individual that's maybe experiencing poverty or is looking for a way to be offered a better opportunity at life, being able to get a more higher paying job, they might go to a person's home country, or they might, park out at like schools or the malls and really try to advertise this opportunity for better work. One that we are seeing that is becoming a bigger and more growing place for recruitment to happen is on the internet. So taking into consideration youth are being exposed to the internet and have grown up with the internet since they've been born. So they're going to get exposed at a younger age. There's a lot of opportunity for individuals to download social media apps or different gaming websites to be able to interact with people throughout the world. So if we're talking about using Instagram, it could give them traffickers the opportunity to recruit individuals, request them on Instagram, start private messaging them, really building that rapport and building that trust. And so we are seeing internet becoming one of those growing places for recruitment to occur. So kind of jumping gears, so talking about all the information that we've had so far, there is this really, really large aspect of power and control that we do see in trafficking situations, so that the relationship between a trafficker and a victim are oftentimes very complex, and there's a lot of power and control that comes into play when we're talking about situations of human trafficking. On here, we see this power and control wheel as it relates to sex and labor trafficking. Some that I do want to highlight and that we often see is that power control can be used by the trafficker beating, burning, withholding food from individuals. There can be sexual assault, isolation, whether that be physical or emotional, psychological abuse, threats that can often in times include their family, holding or destroying immigration papers and threatening deportation is one of the biggest control tactics that we do see, especially if we're talking about individuals that are coming here and working on some sort of visa or undocumented here in the States. There can be that threat of deportation if they don't follow and do exactly what they say. Their trafficker will threaten that they're going to call ICE or report them to the police and really take advantage of their lack of knowledge about certain laws and their rights here in the States and kind of use that as a way to control them. Another one that we often tend to see is debt bondage. So again, had I mentioned before, maybe if we're talking about an individual that's coming from their home country into the US and their trafficker was the one that helped them get them and their family here to the US, having that debt bondage and that control over them, saying this is how much money you owe me, this is how you're going to pay me off. Maybe extra debt gets included depending on their behavior, things of that sort of nature. Talking about drug and alcohol dependency, Emma touched on this, that a risk factor and vulnerability was substance use. So a trafficker will oftentimes either notice that a person has a substance use addiction and will use that as a way to kind of entice them and get them to build trust with them. And so maybe they're providing them that drug or providing them that alcohol or that money to support that addiction as a way to keep them in control of them, or maybe they'll use it as a way to bond with them. Oftentimes we have heard situations where their trafficker maybe shows up as an intimate partner and is saying, oh, hey, let's just, do this certain drug or, engage in drinking as a way for us to bond and get closer together. And then that trafficker ultimately ends up using that way to bond with them and use that substance as a way to keep them in their trafficking situation and have them be dependent on that trafficker to be able to supply that addiction.
Yeah, so we often get this question, right? Why they don't leave and why do they come back? And we also get this question not only in human trafficking, but also in domestic violence and sexual assault. So there's different, multiple things, right? And every person is different, but basically we have listed a couple. There's the trauma bond, there's substance use disorder, there might be romantically involved with the trafficker, fear of loneliness, economic dependency, loyalty, social support, sense of belonging, brotherhood, sisterhood, disordered sense of freedom, belief that there's no way out. Traffickers will often make victims feel like they're in this together. The victims needs to engage in commercial sex so they can pay for a hotel room, so they can afford to buy food, drugs, and basically survive. And victims often will say that it was their idea that they could have stopped at any point, and the trafficker does love them. This shows how effective the grooming process is and how strong that invisible rope is. They create these norms in victims in their head that that this should that this is the life that they should live, and they convince them that they cannot get out. And then traffickers often use drugs too, so that is a very big component of these relationships. But yes, we want to make sure that we don't make them feel like it's their fault, because of course it's not their fault. It is a crime, and anyone is able to get out, right? But it just does take time, and they need those support systems and being able to first recognize it, right? And
Mhm.
us having this conversation so we can prevent it from happening.
Yeah. Perfect.
So yes, we want to have a changes from the perspective, right? Just talking about victim blaming. We don't want to make someone feel like it's their fault. We always want to be open-minded and caring and, empathetic when someone comes up to us. This is a very hard subject, working with survivors of sexual assault. I remember very few will disclose human trafficking, because I feel like there's an added a stigma to it,
Mhm.
because it's such a hard experience, right? So we just want to be really careful, and we want to shift our way of thinking from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. We don't want to label people, right? We just want to make sure that this is something that has happened to them, but it's nothing is wrong with them, right? People are able to heal, but just knowing that that is very important to have that lens of healing and being trauma informed when we're helping survivors of human trafficking.
Absolutely. So I think, is this one me? All
Yes.
right. So talking about the reaction of a parent or a guardian to disclosure. So, depending on where you stand, on who you're having that conversation with, this can also be applied to just a person that you care about if you're having a conversation with them. Again, to just reiterate Emma's point that we mentioned in the earlier presentation is that we are mandatory reporters. And so if we are seeing any instances of a child or an older individual, if any sort of instance of abuse or neglect, we are mandatory reporters and we should be reporting that to law enforcement or DCFS. But also a really important thing to do when we're having conversations with folks and they are disclosing information to us that might relate to human trafficking is making sure that we're establishing trust. Using active listening, we want to be attentive for this individual because this might have been a really, really hard thing for them to talk about. And it could have taken a lot of, bravery and courage to really have that conversation. And so making sure that we're using those active listening skills, ensuring that we're not having any sort of judgment. Again, really changing that perspective from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. We do not want to instill judgment on this individual. We want to make sure that we're ensuring love and care, being aware of our emotions, our behavior, our vibe. We do not want to be having a conversation with an individual with our arms crossed and us continuously looking at our phone. We need to be attentive for these conversations, making sure that we're avoiding taking the use reaction personally. Trauma shows up in different ways. And sometimes if somebody is reacting in a negative way, or maybe reacting in a way that we didn't necessarily think that they were going to, making sure that we're not taking that reaction personally. And just, again, reminding ourselves that this person is disclosing something that is very scary and that we need to make sure that we're meeting them where they're at. So kind of to draw back on Emma's point when we were talking about why don't they leave, why do they come back, having this understanding that the relationship that the trafficker and a victim oftentimes has is very nuanced and complex, and there's a lot of power and control dynamics at play. And so maybe that individual isn't ready to leave their trafficking situation. Maybe they don't feel safe leaving their trafficking situation right now. But being able to meet them where they're at and not forcing them to do things that they don't want to do is really, really important. Is this one also me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So protective factors that we can use to help prevent abuse. So again, really establishing that trust. How are we establishing trust with this youth? Do we have a good working relationship where this youth can really know that you're a trusted adult to come and talk to and have difficult conversations? We can make sure that we're modeling good behavior and coping skills, that we're establishing open communication, and that we're helping them understand the why when we're guiding behavior. Making sure that there's appropriate monitoring. As we mentioned, internet is one of the biggest places where recruitment can happen. So making sure that we're doing appropriate monitoring, that youth is, being on apps and being safe and using, those safety measures to make sure that they're not having conversations with people that could be potentially exploitive. And then we're always ensuring that the goal of discipline is to teach. We want to make sure that we're teaching our youth, modeling good behavior, really telling them, this is why we're guiding this certain behavior, and just really instilling that positive relationship with our youth. Is this one also me?
Yes, you're
Perfect. Okay, so establishing trust. How can we establish trust? So we can do this by avoiding interviewing the youth. Again, we're realizing that we're having a very difficult conversation with a youth, and we do not want to interview them and bombard them with a lot of questions. Really helping the youth feel comfortable and letting them guide the behavior, reassuring the youth that any abuse is not their fault. We really want to make sure that we're validating the youth's feelings and being supportive, letting them know that they're not alone. We're allowing the youth to not talk or show injuries. Again, that kind of ties back into avoiding interviewing the youth. We do not want to make them talk about things that they aren't necessarily comfortable with. We don't want to make them show injuries. We do not want to put them in an uncomfortable situation. We want to make sure that we're speaking clearly and simply in a language that the youth can easily understand. And again, assessing what the youth would like from you. We're letting the youth guide this conversation. So saying, what do you need from me in this moment? How can I best support you? Is a really, really great way to establish that trust and to always be honest. Again, what an example that I like to use is really just reminding that youth that, I am a mandatory reporter. So if you tell me things that I feel like you might be in danger of, I am going to have to report that. This one also me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So talking about some resources that we have available. Again, if there is an emergency situation and you feel like an individual is in immediate danger, please call 911. There's also the DCFS hotline. We have the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We also have specifically the Utah Attorney General's has a tip line for human trafficking. This isn't for emergencies, but if you do notice something suspicious going on, you can always call them and leave a message and somebody will call you back and look into it. We also have the Internet Crimes Against Children tip line. Again, if you're seeing anything suspicious on the internet that's causing concerns, please call and leave a message. We also have the Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force that is available for training, policy, education, and can get you connected to agencies that can provide case management. Another resource is also our Human Trafficking Support Program. So Andrea Sherman, she's our program director, and then Anthony Paco, he is our program coordinator. So he's really that first point of contact for anybody that's interested in getting access to our services. So, talking a little bit more about our human trafficking support team. So we've talked about human trafficking, what this looks like in Utah, but what are some resources that are available? So our agency or our program specifically has been around since 2010. We serve survivors of human trafficking, so both sex and labor. Throughout the whole entire state of Utah, it doesn't matter their race, their age, their gender, their immigration status, as long as they've been deemed a survivor of human trafficking, we can provide them support services. Their trafficking doesn't even have to occur in the state of Utah. It could occur in their home country or a different state. And our main key focus is our specialized holistic case management. And so I have a list of a bunch of different services that we do provide, but ones that I do want to highlight. Housing assistance is one of the biggest needs that we tend to see with our human trafficking survivors because oftentimes their trafficker is the one that's providing them that housing. And so getting them safe, accessible housing is really, really important. Getting them connected to our mental health support. So we do have a behavioral health team located within our agency, but we can also help them get connected to other agencies that can provide that mental health support. And then also legal advocacy. So our agency doesn't provide legal services in-house, but we do get folks connected to agencies that can help them provide that legal services. So if we're talking about an individual that maybe experienced labor trafficking and came here on a visa and then left that exploitative situation and no longer had that visa, they can be eligible for what we call a trafficking visa, so a T visa that can help them get refugee-like benefits. So getting folks connected to that service is really, really important. And then kind of touching a little bit more on our other program areas, so our outreach and education. I oversee that area of our program, and what that looks like is doing education and training such as this one to the community and to community partners, talking about what human trafficking looks like and kind of special considerations when working with survivors of human trafficking. I also oversee a lot of our outreach efforts, and our main and biggest outreach effort is our weekly drop-in center. So that's located here in Salt Lake. We're operating from 1 to 4 on Thursdays. We provide crisis case management, medical care through 4th Street. We'll often do needle exchange through Soap to Hope. Our staff is also trained to be able to hand out and administer naloxone kits to the community, so to help reverse any cases of overdose. We also provide food, clothing, hygiene, safe sex kits. And then we'll also oftentimes do housing consultations and program consultations. So just talking to folks about what our program is and the services that we offer.
Wonderful. Thank you. So
Mhm.
I'm just going to cover what we do here at Peace House. We are located in Park City and we serve Wasatch and Summit County. We've been around since 1990, 33 years. We started in a small a home in Park City, and now we have a really big building in Park City as well. And we have a shelter that has emergency housing and transitional housing. And we're a shelter that is open to men, women, children, all identities, and even pets, because we know that fairy wants our love, and we just want to make sure that survivors feel like they can also bring their pets. We also have the prevention and education is the department that I oversee. We have the two components, the community presentations and also the schools. At the schools, we teach the Safer Smarter Kids curriculum from pre-kindergarten to fifth grade is an evidence-based curriculum where we teach kids about how to prevent child abuse by providing them tools such as teaching them who's a trusted adult, the triangle of trust, what is a safe touch and unsafe touch, what is a safe secret and unsafe secret. And then in high school, we teach them body boundaries and also how to be a good friend to prevent bullying. And then in high school, we talk about healthy relationships. So that's kind of like our school presentations. And then in the community, we will go pretty much anywhere we're invited. We have the Cut It Out curriculum that is the recognize and refer if they see domestic violence. That one is in the beauty schools and any spas or hospitality. We also have Save Ours, where we will teach about bystander intervention and how to prevent sexual harassment in hotels, restaurants, anywhere where they serve alcohol. And then we also work with parents, groups. We will go to libraries. And then again, if anyone needs a presentation, feel free to reach out. We also have clinical services. We have therapy. We have the sexual assault services. We serve the hospital here in Park City. Anyone that comes in and gets a CODA or rape kit done, they will an advocate will show up from Peace House and then provide services, answer questions, help them out the paperwork, and it's such a great support. We have legal advocacy to help survivors navigate the legal systems. If they need help with a U visa, if they need help with a protective order, or navigating the law enforcement system. And we have a 24/7 helpline that is confidential, and all of our services are free of cost, and we offer them in English and Spanish. So it's just a lot of great services that we encourage the community to use. And if you need help, please call the helpline, our 24/7 helpline.
Perfect. So, if there are any questions, please feel free to email
Yes.
either Emma or myself. We have our contact information up here for any questions or anything.
Oh, yes. And we will have our next training. It's called Helping Classmates Safe by Standard Behavior. And this will be on March 13, 2024 at 5 p.m. We will also have the same presentation in Spanish. And that will be February 14, Valentine's Day at 5 p.m. And it will also be online. So everyone is welcome to join, and it will be in Spanish.
Perfect. We've just got our resources. So thank you guys so much for your time. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.